The historic event that I want to talk about is in 1972 when Nixon visited the People's Republic of China. Prior to that time, the United States and China had had a very hostile relationship, coming off the Korean War when China supported North Korea and we supported South Korea, and the continuing hostilities in Vietnam where China supported North Vietnam and we supported South Vietnam. Relationships between China and the United States were frosty at best. Nixon visited China in 1972, and it was historic, and it really changed the relationship between the United States and China. It opened up China. It also affected me on a personal level because I was Chinese American, and it made being Chinese more acceptable. It also, over time, enabled us to visit our relatives in China. So it really did make a big difference. Historians say that Nixon had three objectives in visiting China. The first was to try to achieve a peaceful resolution of the status of Taiwan. The second was to bring pressure on North Vietnam to achieve a resolution of the Vietnam War. And the third was to balance or reduce the Soviet influence. During the Cold War, it was sort of the United States versus the Soviet Union, and China was a rising presence. And by sort of elevating the status of China, that might give us a little more leverage with the Soviet Union in dealing with a variety of issues. Okay, so what happened was, as during the Communist Revolution, many people fled from mainland China to Taiwan. And my grandmother, who was based in Shanghai and lived in the international zone in Shanghai, was one of the groups of people that fled to Taiwan. So she then lived the rest of her life in Taiwan, but my aunts and uncles and cousins were left in mainland China. My grandmother lived in Taiwan, and so we still had relations with her because she was in Taiwan, which is not part of mainland China. However, my aunts and cousins were all in mainland China. And in fact, we didn't get to visit any of them until many years after Nixon's visit. And it was clear from talking to them that times in China after the Communist Revolution were very, very difficult for the people that lived there. And, you know, we're just lucky that they survived. Communism affected my parents' lives by basically cutting them off from their families. It forced them to make a full commitment to staying in the United States. My mother had a sister that was living in New York City who also stayed because of the Communist Revolution, and she had a brother. So my mother had two relatives in the United States, but they left a sister behind and some cousins and my grandmother in Taiwan. My father, his only relatives were back in mainland China. And like many immigrants, you know, he sent money home to his mother for many, many years. But when most people would go and visit their relatives and had large extended families in the United States, you know, we had a relatively small family. And what we had was all the way in New York City, which was from California too far to visit very often. I think my parents both came to the United States for a better education and a better life. My father was a farmer, and he was a scholarship student. He was very smart and did very well academically and got academic scholarships to come to the United States to study. And he ultimately became a mining engineer. My mother was the daughter of a rich entrepreneur, basically. And so she came out also to study and get a degree. They met in New York City when they were both attending graduate school at Columbia University. It's kind of interesting that my parents lived the American dream. They came to the United States as immigrants with very little. My father came with basically nothing. And what my mother had at some point turned into nothing, because once the Communist Revolution happened, then she was cut off from support from her relatives in China. So from that, they raised 4 girls. My dad worked as an engineer for many years, and then he became a real estate broker and ultimately invested in real estate and the stock market and lived the American dream. My parents first moved from New York City to Butte, Montana. And my parents say they did encounter racism in Montana. They said one of the reasons that they left Montana for California was because that none of the other children would play with my oldest sister, who was the only one born at the time. I don't remember Montana. I think I was 1 or 2 years old when we moved. They moved to California because California had a larger Asian population. I personally encountered very little discrimination in California. There were 1 or 2 times when people said inappropriate things, but it was very rare. I also grew up in a mostly white community. I think there were, 2 Chinese families in the town and going to the same elementary school that I grew up in. Because there were relatively few Chinese families when we grew up, my mother made an effort to try to help the other American families become more comfortable and appreciate the Chinese culture. So she and some of the other Chinese women would do Chinese cultural days in the public schools. That's not something that our school district, for example, really needs, because it has a much larger Asian population. But I thought it was really sweet that my parents did that, because that's not something that she would naturally be particularly comfortable doing. But she did it to make the lives better for her kids, so people would be more understanding of the Chinese culture and Chinese children. I don't speak Chinese because my parents in the United States always felt that they were limited by their Chinese accent. So they wanted to be sure their children grew up speaking English like Americans. So they didn't speak to us in Chinese. They wanted us to learn English first and well, which we did. By the time they decided maybe it would be good for us to learn Chinese, we were kind of too old and didn't want to learn. They sent us to Chinese school. I remember spending Friday nights for many years going to Chinese school, where they would try to teach us Chinese, but they didn't teach us in the American way. And that's the way we all had learned how to learn, through the American school system. So after many years of Friday nights at Chinese school, I pretty much didn't learn anything. When my father died in about 1980, my mother wanted to do something to honor him. So she created a scholarship fund in his hometown. He came from a small farming village. And a lot of kids there don't necessarily have the best educational opportunities either. So she created a scholarship fund in his name for the outstanding students at both the elementary, middle, and high school levels. And she funded that scholarship program continuously from 1980 to now, so that people in his hometown remember my father because of his scholarship fund.